Welcome to the Explainer. If you're focused on understanding the true forces moving the markets today, you are in the exact right place. We're diving into an introduction to geopolitics. Because for an investor, understanding global events, well, it isn't just about reading the news over your morning coffee. It's about seeing how those events actively shape the modern investment landscape. We're talking about things that affect everything from economic growth to market volatility and ultimately, your bottom line.
Okay, let's dive right into this. How can a border dispute, or maybe a sudden tariff change 5,000 miles away, literally tank your local portfolio? I mean, it happens all the time, right? The deeply interconnected nature of our world means that macro geopolitics, they aren't just academic theories anymore. No way. They tie directly to your wallet and the daily performance of your investments.
To understand exactly why that happens, we need to quickly define our core term. Geopolitics is the study of how geography affects politics and international relations, just establishing a shared, solid academic baseline here for the rest of the explainer. Think of it as the absolute foundation for assessing how totally different global actors interact over shared goals, borders, and resources.
To make this massive topic completely digestible, here's our 6-part roadmap. First up, the global chessboard. 2. Cooperation and globalization. 3. The referees of trade. 4. Four archetypes of behavior. 5. The tools of geopolitics. And finally, 6. Navigating risk.
Starting right off with Section 1, the global chessboard, and meeting the players. Before we can even start to understand the strategies, we have to recognize that geopolitics is a super complex game, and it's played by two main groups. On one side, we have state actors. These are your national governments, political leaders, parliaments, basically the entities that exert direct sovereign authority over a country's national security and its resources. But on the flip side, we have non-state actors. Think NGOs, multinational corporations, or even just highly influential individuals. They participate heavily in global economic and financial affairs, but they operate globally without that direct national authority.
Moving to Section 2, Cooperation and Globalization, where we define the rules of the game.
Now that we know exactly who's on the board, let's look at the two major axes that define how they interact. The first axis is a spectrum from political cooperation to non-cooperation. Basically, countries choose to engage or restrict based on their own unique hierarchy of national interests. A cooperative country, they're going to focus on rules standardization, harmonizing tariffs, and allowing the free movement of capital and technology. But, by contrast, a non-cooperative country, they might impose inconsistent, maybe even arbitrary rules, restrict the movement of goods across their borders, and use retaliation to protect their domestic spheres.
And this builds our second spectrum, globalization versus nationalism. While political cooperation is usually driven by state actors, globalization is largely driven by non-state actors, like private corporations. They're out there seeking active trade and capital flows, mostly motivated by increasing profits or finding intrinsic gains, like shared knowledge. Nationalism, well, that sits on the complete opposite end. It actively promotes domestic interests to the exclusion of others, which results in very limited cross-border financial and economic cooperation.
Next up, Section 3, the referees of trade, looking at international trade organizations.
So with all these state and non-state actors pursuing completely different interests, who actually maintains order? We rely on institutions built out of the post-World War II Bretton Woods Conference. Now, the crucial point here is clearly separating their distinct mandates because they do very different things. The IMF is singularly focused on the stability of the international monetary system and exchange rates. The World Bank? Totally different job. They focus on helping developing countries fight poverty and enhancing economic growth. And then you have the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which provides the strict legal foundation for global trade and handles all those messy international dispute settlements.
Section 4, four archetypes of behavior, or the playbooks.
All right, this brings us to the climax of our framework. What exactly happens when we combine our two axes? Well, this 2x2 matrix brilliantly illustrates the dynamic nature of international relations. By mapping globalization versus nationalism on the vertical axis and cooperation versus non-cooperation on the horizontal axis, we reveal 4 distinct country archetypes. We've got autarky, hegemony, multilateralism, and bilateralism. Literally every country falls somewhere on this matrix, and tracking where they sit tells you exactly how they're likely to behave.
Let's bring that top right quadrant to life.
Singapore is a phenomenal example of multilateralism in action. As a highly cooperative actor, it consistently ranks as one of the most open, pro-business economies on Earth. It capitalizes on its geographic location right at the intersection of major global trade routes, it features incredibly stable institutions, and it's deliberately fully integrated its private firms into global supply chains.
Now, objectively exploring the opposite end of the spectrum, we look at the bottom left quadrant, autarky. Venezuela serves as a really concrete example of this behavior. An autarkic state seeks extreme political self-sufficiency. You'll often see state-owned enterprises controlling strategic domestic industries here. By prioritizing political self-determination over international integration, Venezuela has taken a largely non-cooperative stance. And that's a mechanism that has resulted in substantial international economic sanctions and pretty steep humanitarian and economic costs.
Moving right along to Section 5, the tools of geopolitics. Let's look at the arsenal. We've seen the playbooks, but what specific tools do they use to actually execute these strategies? Now, what's really interesting about this is that the exact same category of tool can be used to either build a bridge or instantly escalate a conflict. For example, looking at national security, a military alliance like NATO is used to cooperatively reduce conflict, right? While armed conflict or espionage does the exact opposite. Economically, you can use multilateral trade agreements to cooperate or non-cooperatively force the nationalization of industries. And financially, allowing free currency exchange builds trust, whereas using sanctions to limit capital access, that is a severe non-cooperative weapon.
Sometimes these tools overlap in really fascinating ways. Take a look at cabotage. Now, that might sound like a fancy French cheese, but it's actually the right of a foreign firm to transport passengers or goods strictly inside another country's borders. Think about it. To allow a foreign truck driver to cross your country, you have to intertwine physical national security measures with very specific economic rules. It's a surprising, real-world example of how deeply intertwined these tools truly are when they're used cooperatively.
And finally, Section 6, navigating geopolitical risk. Let's check the scorecard.
Let's bring this explainer all the way home to your portfolio. As an investor, your risk rises whenever the board shifts. We categorize these risks into 3 types. You've got event risks, like a sudden election outcome, exogenous risks, like a sudden pandemic out of nowhere, and thematic risks, which are those long-term trends like climate change. So how do you assess these threats? You weigh their likelihood, the velocity at which they'll hit the market, and their ultimate impact. To protect yourself, you absolutely have to use scenario analysis, mapping out the best and worst-case outcomes, and just relentlessly track signposts, like sudden shifts in alliances or supply chain vulnerabilities.
Because ultimately, understanding geopolitics isn't just some academic exercise. As these country archetypes constantly shift, how exposed is your own portfolio to the next move on the global chessboard? Take this matrix, look really closely at your own investments, and ask yourself if you're prepared for the reality of the next global shift. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.